In this heartfelt journey, Sarah Montgomery, a dedicated nurse, finds herself at a crossroads, struggling with her mother's illness and financial hardships. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, she meets Nathaniel, a man disguised as a homeless stranger whose generosity changes her life forever. But as their bond deepens, Sarah faces her greatest challenge, learning to trust, open her heart, and embrace love. Will she let go of her fears and accept this unexpected love? Tune in to discover how vulnerability can lead to healing and an unforgettable future. Where are you tuning in from? Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. The rain poured relentlessly, as if it had a mind of its own, battering against the windows of St. Jude's Hospital. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel smaller, the chaos in the emergency room echoing the fury of the storm outside. Sarah Montgomery, a 24-year-old nurse, glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. Her double shift was nearly over, but the weight of the hours felt endless. She had already been on her feet for over 16 hours, tending to patients with broken bones, fevers, and countless other ailments, her body aching with every step. The exhaustion weighed on her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the next wave of patients being wheeled in through the sliding doors, the shrill sounds of sirens drowning out even the storm. In the middle of the hectic scene, a solitary figure caught her attention. Through the downpour outside, an ambulance had just arrived, and among the chaos, a man was wheeled in. His clothes tattered and soaked through, his face contorted in pain. His hands gripped his chest, and his eyes were wide with fear. Sarah's heart tightened as she watched the man struggle, his chest rising and falling erratically. He couldn't have been more than 35, though his features were weathered, his skin pale and drawn, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from years of hardship. She took a deep breath, brushing a lock of damp hair away from her forehead, and squared her shoulders. It didn't matter who this man was or what he looked like. He was in pain, and it was her job to help him. Her colleague, Janelle, noticed the man too, and let out a sharp sigh. "Another homeless guy," she muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes. "Probably just wants a warm bed on a stormy night." Sarah felt her blood simmer at Janelle's words. It was a remark that carried no sympathy, no empathy, just judgment. But Sarah knew better. She had seen too many people fall through the cracks, dismissed by the world because they didn't fit into the neat boxes society created. "He's a patient," Sarah replied firmly, her voice colder than she meant it to be. "I'll take care of him." Without waiting for a response, Sarah moved toward the man, who was now slumped in a wheelchair, his lips turning a bluish shade. "Can you hear me?" she asked gently, crouching down beside him, her knees sinking into the wet floor. "Can you breathe? Does your chest hurt anywhere else?" The man's only response was a groan, a deep, raspy sound that made Sarah's concerns spike even higher. She touched his arm, and immediately noticed how smooth his skin was, a stark contrast to the rough hands she'd grown accustomed to seeing in the air. Something about him didn't add up, but she ignored the niggling thought and focused on what mattered: his health. "Let's get you inside," she said, her voice steady as she helped him into a nearby exam bay. The noise of the ear faded to a dull hum as she shut the curtain around them, creating a small, temporary haven amidst the storm. The man's condition was serious, his pulse erratic and the pain in his chest intense. But despite his suffering, there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself, as though he was accustomed to hardship, but never willing to let it break him. Sarah quickly moved to work, checking his vitals, listening to his heart, trying to piece together what was happening. The storm outside raged on, but inside, a different kind of tension was building. She pressed the stethoscope against his chest, hearing the rapid and uneven beats of his heart. It didn't sound immediately life-threatening, but it was still a cause for concern. She administered oxygen and gave him fluids, trying to stabilize his condition. As she worked, she couldn't help but notice something peculiar. The way he spoke, His voice, soft but clear, wasn't what she would expect from someone who had been living on the streets. It was almost refined. A voice like that shouldn't belong to someone dressed in rags. Hours passed, and Sarah continued to check on him during the quiet moments between patients. With each passing minute, her curiosity grew, though she knew better than to pry. People ended up in the ear for all kinds of reasons. She focused instead on the man's condition, keeping him comfortable, reassuring him whenever she could. Despite the exhaustion pulling at her body, she felt something deeper. An emotional pull she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was because he didn't demand her attention like so many others. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was simply accepting the care she offered, as if it were his right, not a favor. Later that night, after the storm had calmed and the hospital had returned to its chaotic routine, Sarah returned to check on him one last time. She found him awake, his eyes flickering open, as he weakly reached for the crackers and juice she'd brought him. He didn't ask for much. Just a little comfort, a little nourishment, and maybe, in his own quiet way, a little kindness. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice still hoarse but full of sincerity. His words struck Sarah deeply, a reminder of how much she had given, even in the smallest ways. "You're welcome," she replied, smiling gently. "Everyone deserves kindness." As she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this man than met the eye. But no matter how hard she tried, there was no way for her to know his story. Not yet. But she hoped, somehow, that the storm had brought him to her for a reason. The hours stretched on as Sarah continued to manage the constant rush of patients in the ear. She was running on fumes, every part of her body aching, but there was no time to rest. Her shift wasn't over, and she had a responsibility to each patient that came through the door. Yet, despite the flood of patients, her mind kept drifting back to the man she had helped earlier that night. She couldn't shake the image of him, the way he had looked at her with those eyes full of gratitude yet hiding something deeper. His presence lingered in her thoughts as she moved from one task to another, each patient requiring her full attention. But somehow, he was still there in the back of her mind. It wasn't until the early morning hours that she was able to steal a quiet moment to check on him again. The ear was quieter now, with the frantic pace of the storm giving way to a more controlled chaos. The room was dim, only the occasional flicker of overhead lights illuminating the sterile environment. As Sarah walked toward the cubicle where the man had been, her heart skipped a beat when she noticed that the bed was empty. There was no sign of him, no indication that he had ever been there at all. She felt a jolt of panic shoot through her chest, a tightness that she couldn't explain. He couldn't have just left, not in the condition he had been in. He had been unwell, still weak and pale from the ordeal. Sarah quickly pulled back the curtain, her eyes scanning the empty space. His clothes were gone. His jacket, the one she had seen soaked and torn when he arrived, was no longer draped over the chair. The only evidence he had been there was the set of hospital scrubs she had provided him, neatly folded and placed at the foot of the bed. The smell of antiseptic and faint traces of the storm still clung to the air, but nothing else. A wave of disbelief washed over her. She checked the hallway, the triage station, even the small bathroom in the corner, but he was nowhere to be found. The other nurses, distracted by their own duties, didn't seem to notice his absence. Janelle, passing by, glanced into the empty cubicle, then shrugged. "Told you he'd vanish," she muttered, not bothering to slow down. "They never stick around, just like all the others." Sarah's stomach tightened, the words hitting her harder than they should have. It wasn't that she cared what Janelle thought. It was the man's absence that unsettled her. She had felt a responsibility toward him, a connection even, though she couldn't explain it. Why would he leave without saying anything? Without giving her a chance to check on him one last time? Frustration bubbled up inside her, followed by a deep sense of helplessness. She had spent hours caring for him, offering him the only things she had to give. Her time, her compassion. Yet here he was, gone without a trace. Sarah pressed her hand to her forehead, pushing the panic and frustration away. He was an adult after all. If he was an adult after all, if he was well enough to leave, then there was nothing she could do to stop him. But something about it didn't sit right. Later that day, after her shift ended, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She had walked through the hospital, checked every corner, and even asked a few colleagues, but no one had seen him. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air. The thought gnawed at her as she made her way home. Exhausted, but unable to quiet the questions that swirled in her mind. The bus ride was a blur, the dull thrum of the engine doing little to ease her anxiety. She stepped off at her stop, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. Her apartment, small and cluttered, greeted her with the familiar sight of overdue bills and empty coffee cups. She had barely enough to scrape by each month, her paycheck swallowed by the mounting cost of her mother's treatments. It was a constant struggle, and some days the pressure felt unbearable. As she sat down at the kitchen table, sorting through the pile of mail, a small, unmarked envelope caught her eye. It was plain, with no return address, just her name typed neatly on the front. Her brow furrowed as she carefully opened it, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, she found a cashier's check for $50,000. Her heart skipped a beat as she read the accompanying note. For your mother's care. Thank you for your kindness. A friend. She stared at the check, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. $50,000. It was more money than she made in a year. The note was brief, with no further explanation. Her mind raced. Who could have sent this? The only person she had helped that night was the man in the, But no, this didn't make sense. If it had been him, why wouldn't he have left his name? And why such a large sum? With shaking hands, she called the bank's helpline, her voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. The representative confirmed that the check was legitimate, drawn from a reputable bank. Sarah sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. Could it really be him? The man she had helped? Or was it someone else? The idea felt too surreal, yet a small part of her couldn't dismiss it. Could this stranger, this man in rags, be the one to change her life so dramatically? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, as Sarah tried to process the gravity of what had just happened. Was this a sign? And if so, what was it trying to tell her? For the next few days, Sarah found herself in a haze of uncertainty. The check, with its staggering amount of money, sat heavy in her bag, weighing her down. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering who had sent it, and why. The idea that it had come from the man she had helped in the seemed too far-fetched, but there was a nagging pull at her heart that made her hesitate. It had to be him, didn't it? No one else would be so anonymous, so selfless. But then, why the secrecy? Why leave without saying anything? It didn't add up, and the confusion ate at her. At work, she went through the motions, her mind constantly drifting back to the check and the strange encounter in the E. Her colleagues, oblivious to the turmoil inside her, carried on as usual. Yet there was an odd silence between Sarah and them. She hadn't mentioned the check to anyone, not even Lucy, her best friend, who would have been the first to demand answers. She couldn't explain it. It felt too personal, too surreal. The hospital was quieter now, the frenzy of the storm and the aftermath beginning to fade into memory. But in the midst of that quiet, the questions about the man never left Sarah. She couldn't help but wonder, where was he now? Was he okay? She thought back to his eyes, those deep, searching eyes. He had seemed so out of place in the yet there was something about him that didn't match his appearance. It was as if his body and the life he was living didn't align with his soul. Then, just as the days seemed to drag on without resolution, the phone rang. Sarah's heart lurched when she saw the hospital's number flashing on the screen. It wasn't unusual to get calls from the ear, but this one felt different. With trembling hands, she answered, "Sarah, this is Amanda from the board," the voice on the other end said, a little too chipper for the time of day. "We've received an invitation for you to attend our annual charity gala this week. We would like to personally extend the invitation, and your entrance fee has already been covered." Sarah blinked, the phone almost slipping from her hand. "What? Why? Why would I?" "We have a sponsor. Someone who would like to remain anonymous, who specifically requested that you be there. It's a special gesture," Amanda continued, her tone too smooth. "We'll see you there, right?" Still reeling from the sudden news, Sarah muttered her agreement, though she had no idea what she was agreeing to. Her mind was spinning. A gala. For what reason? Who had nominated her? And why would someone cover her fee? She sat in a daze as the call ended, her thoughts running wild. The whole thing felt so orchestrated. The anonymous benefactor, the check, the gala. It all seemed connected in a way she couldn't fully understand. The night of the event arrived quickly, and Sarah found herself staring at a glittering invitation in her hand, unsure of what to expect. The gala was being held at the prestigious Westlake Grand Hotel, an establishment so lavish that Sarah had never even thought about stepping foot inside, let alone attending an event there. She felt completely out of her element as she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she had borrowed from Lucy. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Her hands were still clammy as she stared at her reflection, wondering if she belonged in such a place at all. Arriving at the hotel was an overwhelming experience. The grand lobby was buzzing with energy, everyone impeccably dressed, their laughter mingling with the soft music of a string quartet. Sarah felt small amidst the sea of high-profile doctors, wealthy donors, and executives. She couldn't even imagine why someone would want her there, let alone cover her entrance fee. But when she stepped inside, there was a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle change in the air, as if she had just stepped into a world she didn't understand. And in that world, she felt like an outsider. As she stood near the entrance, trying to find a familiar face, she saw him. Nathaniel Blackwell, the man she had helped in His presence was striking, impossible to ignore. He was dressed in a sleek tuxedo, his hair combed back with effortless style. He looked nothing like the disheveled figure she had cared for in the hospital. He was confident, commanding, yet there was something deeply familiar about him. The way his eyes met hers across the crowded room, the recognition was instant. Her breath caught in her throat. The man she had taken care of was not some anonymous figure in need. He was someone else entirely. A philanthropist, a millionaire, a person who had orchestrated this whole event in her honor, it seemed. The pieces clicked together in her mind, but the realization was dizzying. How could she have not known? How could she have not known? How could she have not seen it before? He made his way toward her, his expression warm and calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. As he reached her side, he offered a small, knowing smile, and Sarah's heart began to race. Everything she had thought she knew about this man was suddenly upended, and she felt both embarrassed and awed by the connection they had shared. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make her stomach flutter. "It's good to see you again. I owe you more than words can say." The gala was in full swing, a whirl of sparkling gowns, crisp tuxedos, and bright smiles. Sarah stood at the edge of the ballroom, feeling utterly out of place. Her simple black dress, borrowed from Lucy, seemed modest amidst the sea of extravagant outfits and high-profile guests. Her hands were clammy, her nerves frayed with every passing second. As she glanced around the grand space, the weight of the night pressed down on her chest. She felt like an imposter in this world of wealth and privilege, a far cry from the ear's chaotic, gritty reality. But despite her discomfort, there was one undeniable thing. She was here for a reason, and somehow, that reason had everything to do with the mysterious man she had helped weeks ago. Her thoughts were interrupted when she felt a presence beside her, a familiar warmth in the midst of the sea of strangers. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She had felt him before in the dimly lit room, the weight of his gaze even more intense now in the luxurious space. When she finally looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Nathaniel Blackwell stood there, his posture confident, his eyes focused on her with an expression that was both familiar and entirely new. The man who had been drenched in the storm and barely able to speak now stood before her, impeccably dressed, radiating an effortless charisma that was impossible to ignore. "Sarah," he greeted her, his voice low and smooth, like silk sliding across her skin. "I'm so glad you could make it." His presence was magnetic, and for a moment, the bustling crowd seemed to fade into the background. Sarah swallowed hard, struggling to find her voice. I didn't expect this," she finally managed, her words feeling clumsy in her mouth. Nathaniel gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm sure you didn't. But it's important to me that you know how much I appreciate everything you did for me that night." Sarah's heart raced, and she felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She wanted to say something, to ask questions, but all she could manage was a shaky breath. Everything felt surreal. The transformation in Nathaniel, his sudden reappearance, the money, the gala. It was like something out of a dream, yet it was all happening in front of her, too real to ignore. As if sensing her confusion, Nathaniel took a small step closer. "I know this is a lot to take in," he said softly, his eyes filled with an earnestness that made her heart flutter. "But I wanted to thank you for everything. For seeing me, not as a homeless man, not as someone who could offer nothing, but as a person. You helped me when I was at my lowest, and I'll never forget that." Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. She had helped him because it was the right thing to do, because she couldn't turn her back on someone in pain. But hearing him speak like this, hearing his gratitude so openly was almost too much. It was more than she had ever expected. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat, and she found herself lost in his gaze. He seemed to sense her struggle. "You might be wondering why I'm doing this, why I'm here. The truth is, I lost something very important to me not long ago. Someone close to me. And in that grief, I lost sight of what truly mattered. I disguised myself that night because I wanted to see if kindness still existed in the world. And you showed me that it does. You gave me something I had lost, a belief in humanity." Sarah felt her heart ache as he spoke. She hadn't known the full extent of his pain, hadn't understood the depth of his struggles. But hearing him now, she realized just how much her simple act of kindness had meant to him. It wasn't just a gesture to him, it was a lifeline, a moment that helped restore a piece of his faith in people. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again," Nathaniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But when I learned about your situation, about your mother's health and your own struggles, I couldn't ignore it. I wanted to help you, Sarah. I want to help you." His words, so sincere, so deeply heartfelt, made Sarah's pulse quicken. She had never expected anything in return for her kindness. To her, it was just what you did for people in need. But Nathaniel's offer, his willingness to step into her life with such openness, was overwhelming. It was a stark contrast to the way people often treated others with indifference or pity. Nathaniel didn't look at her with judgment, or see her as someone to be rescued. He saw her as an equal, and that made all the difference. "I don't know what to say," Sarah whispered, the weight of the moment sinking in. "This is all so much. I didn't do anything special." Nathaniel smiled, a small, reassuring smile that softened his features. "You did more than you know. Your kindness changed everything for me." Sarah's heart swelled with emotion. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, standing in the midst of the grand ballroom, it didn't seem to matter. All the uncertainty, all the doubts melted away in the face of Nathaniel's sincerity. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear. Her life had changed in ways she never could have imagined. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. The days that followed the gala passed in a blur for Sarah. She found herself torn between gratitude and uncertainty, as Nathaniel's offer of help hung heavily in her mind. His words had left an indelible mark on her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was too good to be true. There was a part of her that questioned his motivations. After all, why would a man like him, so successful and powerful, care about someone like her? She had never asked for help, never expected anyone to step into her life in such an overwhelming way. Still, the generosity he had shown felt genuine, his sincerity undeniable. The reality of her own struggles kept her grounded. Her mother's condition had worsened, the medical bills piling up faster than Sarah could keep track. No matter how many extra shifts she took, no matter how tightly she pinched every penny, it never seemed to be enough. She couldn't bear to see her mother suffering, unable to afford the treatments she desperately needed. Yet she refused to ask Nathaniel for more, unable to bring herself to lean on him when it felt like she should be standing on her own 2 feet. She had spent a restless night, her mind racing with the possibilities of what Nathaniel's offer could mean for her future. She could accept the help, take the weight off her shoulders, and allow her mother to receive the care she needed, but the thought of being beholden to someone else made her stomach turn. She had always prided herself on her independence, on doing things herself, no matter how hard it got. But Nathaniel's words echoed in her mind. "I want to help you, Sarah." She felt a deep internal conflict, unsure of whether she could accept this level of generosity without losing something of herself in the process. As the days wore on, Sarah found herself slowly warming to the idea of accepting Nathaniel's help, but not without a great deal of hesitation. She had to admit, deep down, that the thought of no longer worrying about how to pay for her mother's treatments, no longer feeling like she was drowning under the weight of her bills, was an incredibly appealing prospect. But with that appeal came the fear of losing herself, of depending too much on someone who seemed so much more powerful, so much more capable than she could ever be. One evening, after yet another exhausting shift at the hospital, Sarah found herself walking home in a daze. The rain had begun to fall again, light at first, then gradually picking up as she walked down the quiet street toward her small apartment. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, the familiar chill of the evening air a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside her head. The sound of the rain was soothing, a soft rhythm that helped calm her racing thoughts. Yet, even as she walked, her mind wandered back to Nathaniel. Just as she was about to cross the street, her phone buzzed. It was a message from him. Simple and to the point. "I was thinking of you today. I know this isn't easy, but please don't feel like you're alone in this. If you need me, I'm here." The words settled in her chest like a balm, their tenderness more than she'd expected. For a moment, Sarah stood still in the rain, feeling the weight of his message sink in. It wasn't just about the money or the lavish offers of help. It was the quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone, that someone out there, someone who didn't have to care, was willing to stand by her side. With a deep breath, Sarah wiped the rain from her eyes and began to walk again. Her pace a little slower now, her heart a little lighter. She had been fighting so hard to do everything on her own. But maybe it was time to let someone in. Maybe it was time to accept that she didn't have to carry the burden alone. That sometimes the greatest strength came from allowing others to help when it was needed the most. Later that evening, she sat down at her small kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting a soft glow on the check Nathaniel had sent her. The $50,000 that had initially seemed like a bizarre stroke of fate now felt like a lifeline, a bridge between her struggling present and the possibility of a future where her mother's health could be taken care of, where she could finally breathe without the weight of constant worry pressing down on her. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone and dialed Nathaniel's number. When he answered, his voice was warm, comforting, as though he had been waiting for her to call. "Nathaniel," she began, her voice shaky but determined, "I've thought about it, and I've decided to accept your offer. I... My mother needs it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Sarah wondered if he might say something to change her mind. But instead, his response was simple, sincere. "I'm glad you called. You don't have to do this alone, Sarah. I'll be here every step of the way." The words were like a weight lifting off her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the tiniest spark of hope flicker in her chest, knowing that perhaps, just perhaps, this unexpected turn in her life was the beginning of something more than she had ever imagined. The days following her decision to accept Nathaniel's help were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah. It felt as if everything in her life had been turned upside down, but in the most unexpected and overwhelming way. The weight of her mother's medical bills had lifted almost overnight, replaced by a new kind of pressure, the kind that came with realizing just how much she had allowed Nathaniel to do for her. The check he had sent had been a lifeline, but it was still difficult to come to terms with accepting such a grand gesture. She'd been fiercely independent her whole life, and now she was depending on someone else. She couldn't help but feel a little unmoored, unsure of what that meant for her own sense of self. Nathaniel had been patient with her, understanding the complexity of her feelings. He didn't push her to rush into anything, didn't force her to accept more help than she was comfortable with, but there was a softness in his actions, a quiet understanding that made her feel as though she had nothing to prove to him. He was there, not because he had to be, but because he had to be, but because he wanted to be. He didn't ask for anything in return. His generosity was a reminder of something Sarah had forgotten for a long time. That sometimes people did things for others simply out of kindness, without expecting anything back. As Sarah moved through the days tending to her mother's needs with renewed focus, the heaviness of her burdens felt just a little lighter. She no longer had to decide which medication to skip or which treatment to delay. She could give her mother the care she deserved, without the nagging worry of financial ruin hanging over her. But even as the pressure eased, Sarah couldn't stop herself from thinking about Nathaniel. The more she thought about him, the more she realized that he had become more than just a benefactor in her life. He had become someone she trusted, someone who had seen her at her lowest and didn't flinch, someone who had given her not just money, but a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. But that trust, that quiet bond they had formed, was tested one evening when Nathaniel suggested they meet for dinner. Sarah hadn't seen him much in the past few weeks, save for their occasional phone calls. She wasn't sure what to expect, but the thought of seeing him again stirred something deep within her. When they met, it was nothing like she had imagined. There were no grand gestures, no fanfare, just a quiet dinner at a small, cozy restaurant tucked away from the bustling city. It felt intimate, the way their conversation flowed effortlessly. As they talked, Sarah couldn't help but notice the changes in him. He wasn't the cold, detached millionaire who had first appeared before her, but a man who had been shaped by loss, by the pain of being betrayed by those he thought he could trust. He shared stories of his family, of how he had lost someone dear to him and how that loss had changed everything. His vulnerability, his willingness to open up to her, made Sarah feel something she had never expected. A connection that went beyond words. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. Nathaniel was everything she had never expected, a man who had tested her humanity but, in turn, had given her a glimpse into his own brokenness. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But the bond they were forming felt like a quiet promise, a gentle understanding that perhaps they both needed healing in different ways. When they parted that night, Nathaniel placed his hand gently on hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me help, for letting me help, for letting me be a part of your life." Sarah's heart fluttered in her chest as she smiled softly. "You've already helped more than you know," she replied. It was a simple exchange, but it carried more weight than any grand gesture ever could. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this unexpected connection than she had first realized. In the days that followed, their relationship began to evolve, slowly but surely. They spent more time together, talking about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Sarah felt herself opening up to him in ways she hadn't with anyone in years. And with each passing day, the uncertainty that had once clouded her heart began to fade. Nathaniel was no longer just a man who had saved her from financial ruin. He was someone who understood her, someone who didn't judge her for her struggles, but stood by her through them. It was in the quiet moments, in the spaces between the words, that Sarah began to realize that the trust she had built with Nathaniel was something rare and beautiful. She was no longer just the nurse who had helped a stranger. She was someone worthy of love, worthy of care, and worthy of a future that was no longer defined by her fears. The weeks following Sarah's decision to accept Nathaniel's help were filled with a mixture of gratitude and unease. She had finally allowed herself to let go of the constant worry over her mother's medical expenses. The weight that had threatened to crush her every day seemed to lift, but with it came the disquieting realization that she was now dependent on someone else. She had never imagined that her life would turn in this direction, being on the receiving end of such generosity. It wasn't easy for her to accept. She had always been the one helping, the one people turned to in times of crisis. Yet here she was, the one being helped, and it felt almost like a betrayal to her own sense of self. Despite her internal conflict, a small part of her couldn't deny that this change had given her mother the care she so desperately needed. In the midst of this, Sarah found herself unexpectedly growing closer to Nathaniel. Their conversations, once cautious and formal, were now filled with a natural ease. He no longer felt like a distant benefactor, but someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. And, to her surprise, she cared about him too. But her feelings were complicated. The walls she had carefully built around herself were beginning to crack. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, her heart beating a little faster whenever his name appeared on her phone. She had never allowed herself to entertain the thought of a romantic relationship, especially with someone who had such power and wealth. She felt like there were too many barriers, too many things that separated them, that made such a relationship seem impossible. But Nathaniel seemed to break down those barriers effortlessly. One evening, after yet another long shift, Sarah found herself texting Nathaniel, unsure of what to say but needing to talk to him. Her life had become a blur of hospital shifts, financial stress, and caring for her mother. She had barely had a chance to breathe, let alone think about herself. But something about Nathaniel's presence in her life made her feel like she mattered, like she was more than just a nurse, more than just a nurse, more than just someone who was always giving and never receiving. He was there for her in ways no one had ever been before. As she stared at her phone, her fingers hovered over the screen before she typed, "I'm exhausted, and I just need someone to talk to." The reply came almost instantly. "I'm here. Sarah. Always. Come over if you want to talk. We can take a walk or just sit in silence. Whatever you need. The simplicity of his response stirred something in her. Relief, vulnerability, longing. She didn't hesitate. Less than an hour later, she found herself in the familiar warmth of Nathaniel's apartment. The soft light of the city filtered in through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. Nathaniel was waiting for her, a calming presence in the chaos of her life. He didn't rush her, didn't ask for explanations. He simply sat beside her, allowing her the space to breathe. They spent the evening in comfortable silence, with only the soft hum of the city in the background. Nathaniel, as always, was attentive but not intrusive. His presence was like a balm to her weary soul. It wasn't just the material help he had provided. It was the emotional support, the way he saw her, the way he made her feel understood. For the first time in a long while, Sarah allowed herself to relax, to let down the walls she'd spent so many years building around her heart. She found herself talking more freely than she ever had, sharing not just her worries, but also her hopes, her dreams, and the things that scared her most. As they talked, Sarah realized how much her perspective on life had changed. Nathaniel had not only offered her a way out of her financial struggles, but he had also made her see herself differently. She had been so focused on surviving, on just getting through each day, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly live, to open up to others and embrace vulnerability. With Nathaniel, she didn't have to carry the weight of her burdens alone. She could be real, could express herself without fear of judgment. At the end of the night, Nathaniel walked her to the door, his hand gently brushing hers as he opened it. "Thank you," Sarah said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to explain what this has meant to me." Nathaniel smiled, his gaze soft. "You don't have to explain. I just want you to know you're not alone, Sarah. Whatever you need, I'm here." His words, simple yet profound, struck a chord deep within her. She had always believed in her own strength, in the idea that she had to handle everything on her own. But Nathaniel had shown her a different way, one that didn't rely on isolation, but on connection, trust, and the strength that came from sharing your burdens with someone else. As Sarah left his apartment that night, her heart was lighter, her mind quieter. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was drowning. With Nathaniel, there was no rush to solve everything, no pressure to be perfect. There was just acceptance. And in that acceptance, Sarah began to realize that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. Maybe, just maybe, the future didn't have to be a constant battle. Maybe it could be something more, a journey taken with someone who cared enough to walk beside her. The weeks passed, and the growing connection between Sarah and Nathaniel seemed undeniable. What had started as an unexpected lifeline for Sarah, financial support for her mother's care, something Sarah hadn't anticipated. She had never allowed herself to consider the possibility of a relationship with someone like Nathaniel. His wealth, his influence, the gap between their worlds felt insurmountable, and yet every time they spoke, every time they shared a moment, that gap seemed to diminish. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, to the moments when she could simply be with him, unburdened by her worries and fears. But as their bond grew, so did her internal conflict. Despite everything Nathaniel had done for her, Sarah had never allowed herself to fully accept what he was offering. His help, his time, and more than anything, his heart. There was still a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that this was too much, that maybe she didn't deserve this kind of attention, this kind of affection. How could someone like him care about her when she had so little to offer in return? She had always been the caretaker, the one who gave, never the one who received. It made her feel vulnerable, exposed in a way she wasn't sure she was ready for. And yet, every time Nathaniel was around, she felt that familiar tug at her heart, an inexplicable pull that she couldn't resist. One evening, as the soft light of dusk filled the air, Nathaniel invited Sarah to dinner at one of the city's most upscale restaurants. She almost declined, feeling a bit out of place with all the attention he lavished on her. But something in his voice, a quiet insistence that he simply wanted to spend time with her, made her say yes. She hadn't been able to shake the idea that there was more to their connection than just gratitude or friendship, but she was still afraid of what that might mean. The last thing she wanted was to make things complicated, especially after all the help he had already given her. As they sat at the table, surrounded by the elegant atmosphere of the restaurant, Sarah couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The opulence of the room, the crisp white tablecloths, the soft clink of fine china, it all felt like a world that didn't belong to her. Nathaniel, however, seemed completely at ease. He had always moved through life with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he wanted. He was a man who had everything, and yet, for reasons Sarah couldn't quite understand, he seemed intent on sharing his world with her. They spoke about everything and nothing. Small talk about her work, her mother's recovery, his latest project at the foundation. But beneath the casual conversation, there was something unspoken between them, a tension that neither of them could ignore, though neither was willing to address directly. Sarah could feel him watching her with that same intensity that always made her heart skip a beat. She wondered if he felt it too. This pull between them, this undeniable chemistry that neither of them had acknowledged but both secretly hoped for. When the meal came to an end, Nathaniel paid the bill with his usual grace, never even glancing at the price. But as they stood to leave, he surprised her by taking her hand gently in his. His touch was warm, comforting, but it sent a shockwave through her. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the evening settling around them. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat, the words she'd been holding back finally bubbling to the surface. "Nathaniel," she began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to accept all of this. You've already done so much for me, for my mother. I don't want to take more from you. I don't want to take more from you. I don't want to feel like I'm using you." Nathaniel's gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and reassuring, "you're not using me. You never have been. I'm here because I want to be here. I care about you more than you realize. And if you'll let me, I want to be there for you. Not just for your mother, but for you too." Sarah's heart raced at his words, a flood of emotions crashing over her. It wasn't just about the money or the help. It wasn't just about her mother's health or the financial relief he had provided. It was about something far deeper, something she had been too afraid to admit. She had been fighting this feeling for so long, scared to open herself up, scared to let someone in. But now, standing in front of Nathaniel, she realized that this wasn't something to fear. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared of what this means, of what it could become." Nathaniel smiled gently, his thumb brushing across the back of her hand. "You don't have to be scared. We'll take it one step at a time. But whatever happens, I'm here. I'll be here." In that moment, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that maybe this thing between them, wasn't just a fleeting connection, a result of shared hardship. Maybe it was something more, something real, and, for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of her fears begin to lift, replaced by the warmth of possibility. The future, whatever it held, didn't seem so uncertain anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something beautiful. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself slowly unraveling from the tightly wound knot of stress and worry she had carried for so long. Life, despite the ongoing challenges, was starting to feel a little more manageable, and she couldn't deny the part Nathaniel had played in that. The relief she felt from not having to scramble for every dollar to cover her mother's medical bills was undeniable. But as her external world seemed to calm, a storm brewed inside her, an emotional tug, a war that she couldn't seem to shake. The more time Sarah spent with Nathaniel, the deeper her feelings for him grew. But with those feelings came fear. Fear that she wasn't enough for him, that their worlds were too different for something real to develop between them. He had money, power, and influence, things she had never known. And though he had shown her nothing but kindness and understanding, there was always that nagging thought that her own humble existence couldn't possibly measure up to his world. She wasn't just scared of being dependent on him for money, but also for emotional support. She had spent so long living with the belief that she had to be the strong one, the one who held everything together, that the idea of letting someone into her heart, letting them see the parts of her that were vulnerable, felt terrifying. Nathaniel, of course, sensed the distance. He wasn't blind to the way Sarah had pulled back at times, the moments where she would retreat behind walls she had built over years of independence and fear. But he never pressured her. He never pushed for more than she was ready to give. Instead, he quietly waited for her to come to him, to meet him halfway when she was ready. He understood that trust, for Sarah, wasn't something easily given. She had been hurt before, by the world, by people she thought she could rely on. And he knew that it would take time for her to let him in fully. It was one evening after Sarah had finished a late shift at the hospital that everything finally seemed to come to a head. She had just clocked out, exhausted and mentally drained, when Nathaniel sent her a message. "I was thinking of you today. Want to meet for coffee? I think we need to talk." The words seemed simple enough, but there was an urgency in his tone that made Sarah's heart race. She agreed, more out of curiosity than anything else. They met at a quiet cafe in the heart of the city, a little haven away from the noise and chaos of their everyday lives. When Nathaniel arrived, his usual confident demeanor was tinged with something softer, something more vulnerable. His eyes, always so calm and steady, held a flicker of concern as he looked at her. They sat down at a small table by the window, the dim light of the evening casting shadows across his face. "Sarah," Nathaniel began, his voice low, "I know things have been complicated, and I know that I've asked a lot of you, more than you probably ever expected. I just want you to know that you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to carry everything by yourself anymore." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had tried so hard to keep her walls intact, to keep everything in control. But now, with Nathaniel's words, they were starting to crumble. He wasn't asking her to be perfect. He wasn't asking her to have all the answers. He was simply offering to be there, to be her partner in this. She looked down at her hands, unsure of what to say. The fear she had been carrying around for so long, the fear of being vulnerable, of letting someone truly see her, was still there, but it was softer now. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of letting go, of depending on someone else. I've always had to be the strong one, Nathaniel. I don't know how to stop." Nathaniel's gaze softened, and he reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to stop being strong, Sarah. You've been strong for so long, and I admire that. But you don't have to do it all alone. You don't have to carry everything on your own shoulders anymore. I'm here for you." His words, so simple yet so profound, settled into Sarah's heart like a bomb. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who wouldn't let her fall. Someone who saw her, not as a burden or someone to be fixed, but as someone worthy of love, worthy of care, just as she was. Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time, Sarah felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crack. She was no longer afraid of being vulnerable, no longer afraid of being vulnerable, no longer afraid of needing someone. With him, she could breathe, could simply be herself, flaws and all. She wasn't alone anymore. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady now, her heart lighter. "I'm ready to let you in." And with that, the last of her fears seemed to fall away, replaced by the quiet certainty that, together, they could face whatever the future held. The days that followed Sarah's acceptance of Nathaniel's offer were a blur of emotions and decisions. Though her mind had been made up, she couldn't shake the swirling confusion that accompanied it. She had spent years building a life based on her own strength, but now she had to reckon with the idea of leaning on someone else. It wasn't just about the financial help he provided for her mother's medical bills, though that had been a godsend. It was about what Nathaniel represented. He was kindness, generosity, and unwavering support, but he was also a reminder of how hard it had been for her to trust others, to allow herself to be seen not as the caretaker, but as someone in need of care. Nathaniel was patient, never once pushing her to move faster than she was ready for. His reassurance that she didn't have to do it all alone was comforting. But still, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt each time she let him take the reins. She had been independent for so long, and it was hard to accept help without feeling like she was losing a part of herself. But as the days passed, she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been living her life as fully as she could have. Perhaps this, what she and Nathaniel were building, was something more than just dependency, more than just a connection born out of gratitude. It was about mutual trust and growth. He had given her a lifeline, and now she had the chance to give something back to him. It was on a quiet evening, a few weeks after their last conversation, that Nathaniel took her hand gently in his and led her to a quiet corner of the cafe they had been visiting together. Sarah had noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke, and for the first time, she realized that Nathaniel was just as vulnerable as she was. He wasn't the perfect, untouchable figure she had always imagined him to be. He was a man who had experienced deep loss, who had spent so much of his life hiding behind the walls of his own grief, just as she had hidden behind her own pride. "Sarah," Nathaniel began, his voice soft but unwavering, "I want to tell you something. Something that I should have told you a while ago. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I care about you, and not just because of what you've done for me, but because of who you are." His words hung in the air between them, charged with an emotion Sarah hadn't expected. Her heart stuttered in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, the walls she had carefully constructed around herself began to crumble. It wasn't just his financial help that made her feel indebted. It was his patience, his quiet understanding, and the way he never expected anything in return for the care he showed. But more than that, it was the deep, unspoken bond that had formed between them, a bond built on shared experiences and the silent acknowledgement of each other's struggles. "You've shown me something that I didn't even know I was missing," Nathaniel continued, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand. "Before you, I didn't believe in people like you. People who give without expecting anything. But you've changed that. You've given me back faith in the goodness of people." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and the words she'd been holding back for so long finally tumbled out. "Nathaniel, I've been so scared. Scared that I wasn't enough. That I wasn't enough. That I wasn't worthy of everything you've done. I didn't know how to let someone in, especially someone like you." He smiled softly, his eyes warm as he lifted his hand to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Sarah, you're everything I never knew I needed. You don't have to be perfect. You never have to be perfect. You just need to be you. Tears welled in her eyes as the last of her fears melted away. She had spent so long pushing people away, so terrified of being vulnerable, of letting someone see her weaknesses. But with Nathaniel, she realized she didn't have to hide them anymore. She didn't have to be strong all the time. It was okay to lean on him, just as he had leaned on her when he needed her. They had become something more than just two people caught in a moment of circumstance. They had become partners, each filling in the spaces the other had left empty. "I'm not afraid anymore," Sarah whispered, her voice steady as she looked into his eyes. "I trust you, Nathaniel, and I want to see where this goes. Wherever it leads." The quiet assurance in her words caused Nathaniel to smile, a soft, genuine smile that spoke volumes. "I'm right here, Sarah. We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, Sarah realized that the life she had been living, full of solitary struggle and constant effort, had been only a fraction of what she was capable of. There was a future ahead of her, one built not just on survival, but on love, trust, and partnership. A future that wasn't defined by what she had to give, but by what she could share with someone who truly understood her. With Nathaniel by her side, Sarah felt ready to embrace that future, whatever it held. The weeks that followed Sarah's acceptance of Nathaniel's offer were a mixture of gratitude, introspection, and new beginnings. Sarah had allowed herself to lean on him more, but that decision wasn't without its internal struggles. She found herself opening up more than she ever had, sharing bits of herself with him, and slowly beginning to trust him with pieces of her heart she had once kept buried. Nathaniel, in turn, proved time and time again that his care for her wasn't driven by obligation, but genuine affection. His actions were subtle, patient, and full of understanding. But as their connection deepened, Sarah began to realize that there was something more developing between them. Something that was no longer defined by simple gratitude or kindness. One quiet afternoon, when the hospital had slowed to a rare moment of calm, Sarah found herself with a few precious hours to herself. She sat at the small cafe just outside the hospital, a cup of coffee warming her hands. Her mind wandered back to Nathaniel. Over the past weeks, their connection had blossomed into something undeniably profound. He had become more than just the man who had helped her through the hardest time of her life. He had become someone she couldn't imagine her world without. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Nathaniel. "I know we've been taking things slow, but I think it's time we talk about what comes next. I don't want to hide behind uncertainty anymore. I want to build a future, and I want to do it with you, Sarah." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. She had known they were growing closer, had felt it in the small moments. The way he made her feel understood. The way he made her feel understood. The quiet touches, the long conversations. But hearing him put it into words made it all feel so real, so final. She had been holding on to the idea that she wasn't ready for something more, that maybe the difference in their worlds was too great, but his message made her realize something. She had been waiting for him to ask this very question. With trembling hands, she typed her response. "I've been afraid. Afraid to trust in something more. Afraid of what it means. But the truth is, I can't imagine a future without you in it. I'm ready. I'm ready to see where this takes us." As soon as she sent the message, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. There was no going back now. The uncertainty that had once loomed over her felt lighter. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah realized that she was finally embracing the love and support she had been denying herself for years. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, Nathaniel took Sarah to the place that had become their sanctuary, a quiet park just outside the city. It was where they had first started spending time together, sitting on a bench, talking about their hopes, their fears, and everything in between. Tonight was different, though. There was an unspoken promise hanging in the air, a feeling of something shifting, something changing. Nathaniel took her hand as they sat down on the bench, his fingers intertwining with hers, the weight of his touch grounding her in that moment. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," Nathaniel said, his voice calm, steady, but with an edge of vulnerability that made Sarah's heart ache. "And the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's you I want to share it with. Not just the good moments, but the challenges, the ups and downs. I want to be there with you, Sarah, through everything." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that, for the first time, she wasn't alone. Nathaniel had shown her a love. Nathaniel had shown her a love that was unconditional, a love that didn't ask her to change or be anything she wasn't. He accepted her. Flaws. "I want that too, Nathaniel," Sarah said softly, squeezing his hand. "I've spent so long thinking that I wasn't enough, that I had to handle everything on my own. But you've shown me that it's okay to let someone in, that it's okay to let someone in, that it's okay to need help, to need love. I don't want to hide from that anymore. I'm ready to take this step with you." As the words left her lips, Sarah felt a sense of freedom, a weight lifting off her shoulders. She had spent so much of her life afraid to be vulnerable, to let anyone see the parts of her that felt broken. But now, with Nathaniel beside her, she didn't need to hide. She didn't need to be afraid. Nathaniel smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "We'll figure it out together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." And in that moment, as the cool evening air wrapped around them, Sarah knew that this was the beginning of something beautiful. Something real. For the first time in her life, she was ready to face the future with someone by her side. Not as a crutch, but as a partner. The journey ahead wouldn't be without its challenges, but with Nathaniel, she felt ready to take it on. Together. The days leading up to their wedding felt like a dream that Sarah couldn't quite wake up from. Each morning brought with it a fresh wave of disbelief. How had she gone from a life of constant struggle to this, to being on the verge of marrying a man who had not only changed her life financially, but had also touched her heart in ways she hadn't thought possible? She had spent so much time trying to survive, trying to hold everything together, that the idea of a future filled with love and support had seemed like something far out of reach. Yet now, as she looked at Nathaniel beside her, holding her hand, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude and awe. The small, intimate ceremony they had planned felt perfect for the two of them. There were no grand ballrooms or extravagant decorations, just a few close friends, family, and the people who had supported them throughout their journey. Sarah had always imagined a wedding that was bigger than life, but now, standing on the precipice of this new chapter with Nathaniel, she realized that the most important thing wasn't the spectacle, but the love and commitment they shared. Their wedding, though simple, was filled with an overwhelming sense of warmth and sincerity. The day of the ceremony was crisp, with the air just beginning to turn cooler as autumn crept in. Sarah stood at the front of the small venue, her heart racing in her chest as the first few notes of the music began. She looked around the room at the faces of the people who had walked with her through the hardest moments of her life, who had seen her at her lowest and still stood by her side. And then, as if by instinct, her eyes found Nathaniel, standing across from her, waiting with a quiet smile. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, everything else in the room faded. There was nothing else in the world but the two of them, standing together. When Nathaniel spoke his vows, his voice was steady, full of emotion, but calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. "Sarah, from the first moment I met you, I saw something in you that I hadn't seen in anyone before. You have a strength, a kindness, a courage that never wavers, and it's that strength that has brought us here today. I promise to be by your side, in good times and bad, to be your partner, your support, and your biggest fan. I will love you for who you are, and I will cherish you for the rest of my life." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she listened to him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. This man, this incredible man who had entered her life when she needed him the most, was now promising to stand by her forever. She had never thought she would hear such words, let alone feel so completely and utterly loved. When it was her turn to speak, her voice cracked slightly, but she managed to steady herself. "Nathaniel," she began, her voice shaky but sure, "I spent so many years alone, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid to trust, to let anyone in. But you showed me that it's okay to lean on someone, that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being there for each other through everything. I promise to love you with everything. I promise to love you with everything I have, to equal your partner and your greatest supporter. I will cherish you, not only today, but every day, for the rest of our lives." As they exchanged vows, Sarah felt a shift inside of her, a deep sense of peace settling into her bones. She had come so far from the scared, isolated woman she had once been, and now she stood beside a man who loved her for exactly who she was. The love they shared wasn't just about the highs, the romantic moments, but about the quiet strength they had found in each other's arms during the hardest of times. The reception was small and simple. Just a few close friends and family gathered around to celebrate their new life together. There were no grand speeches, no lavish meals. Just laughter, music, and the warmth of shared joy. Sarah watched as Nathaniel took her hand, leading her to the dance floor for their first dance as a married couple. As the music played softly in the background, she rested her head on his chest, letting the moment wash over her. Everything felt right. Nathaniel leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "This is just the beginning," he whispered. "We've made it this far together, and I know we'll keep moving forward side by side, no matter what." As Sarah gazed up at him, she realized that the future was no longer something to fear. The hardships they had faced, the struggles, the fears, none of it had the power to tear them apart. Together, they had built something stronger than anything either of them had ever known. And in that moment, Sarah knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that their love would carry them through whatever came next. The rest of their lives were waiting, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready. Ready to embrace it, ready to face whatever challenges came, as long as she had Nathaniel by her side. And that, she realized, was all she had ever needed. As we close the chapter on Sarah and Nathaniel's journey, we're reminded of one of the most profound lessons in life. True strength lies not in being independent, but in being open to love, vulnerability, and trust. Sarah spent so many years trying to handle everything on her own, afraid of letting anyone in. But by allowing herself to accept help, to lean on someone else, she found a love that not only lifted her burdens, but also showed her the power of partnership. Sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that make a difference. It's the quiet moments of understanding, the willingness to show up for one another, and the ability to trust and be vulnerable. Through Nathaniel's unwavering support and patience, Sarah learned that asking for help doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. It's a reminder that we don't have to face life's challenges alone. True love is not about perfection, but about acceptance, kindness, and being there for each other in both the good times and the bad. As you reflect on their story, consider your own life. Are there moments where you've been afraid to trust or accept help? How might your relationships grow if you allowed yourself to be more vulnerable? If this story inspired you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you tuning in from, and what part of Sarah and Nathaniel's journey resonated with you? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay connected and continue exploring more heartfelt stories like this one. We can't wait to share more with you